It was a long trip. I was taking a bus to another city, and after hours on the road, the driver decided to stop at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. We needed a break, and I took the opportunity to get off, stretch my legs, and breathe some fresh air. The station was small, simple, and barely lit. The convenience store, with its yellowish lights and somewhat neglected facade, seemed to be the only sign of life in that setting. Most of the passengers preferred to stay on the bus, resting. But I, along with a few others, got off. The night's cold was biting, and the wind seemed to pick up as I moved away from the bus. The area around the station was poorly lit, with flickering lights here and there, and the darkness enveloped everything in the distance. Everything seemed too quiet, except for the rumble of a truck parked nearby, where a trucker leaned against the cab, watching the activity. I decided to head to the convenience store to grab something quick. Inside, the atmosphere was even more deserted than outside. Only the tired-looking clerk was behind the counter as I picked up a snack from the shelf. The place smelled of old coffee and dust. Little did I know that this brief stop would mark the beginning of something strange. As soon as I left the convenience store with my snack, I noticed something odd at the station. The bus driver was outside, near the gas pumps, arguing with a man I hadn't seen before. He seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The man wore a torn jacket and a dirty cap, gesturing wildly and looking agitated, as if nervous or irritated. Even from a distance, it was clear the situation was tense. The driver shook his head, visibly annoyed, trying to end the conversation. Meanwhile, the man kept gesturing and speaking aggressively. Something about that man bothered me. His rough demeanor, his dirty clothes, and his restless behavior seemed out of place, like he didn't belong there. The station lights flickered occasionally, and the night's silence made everything feel even more unsettling. I watched from afar, not daring to get closer. Something told me that man wasn't just there by chance. He cast quick glances around, as if calculating something. Finally, the driver seemed to lose his patience and turned his back, heading back toward the bus. But the man remained still, watching every movement with a fixed gaze. A chill ran down my spine. After the driver returned to the bus, the man in the torn jacket approached the trucker, who was leaning against his vehicle, talking with the store clerk. They exchanged a few words, but the atmosphere seemed different from the earlier interaction. The trucker eyed him cautiously, clearly not eager to continue the conversation. The man gestured less now, but still had a restless air about him. He spoke quietly, with his cap covering part of his face, making it hard to see his expression. The trucker nodded a couple of times, but clearly wanted the conversation to end quickly. I watched from inside the bus, trying to figure out what was going on. The situation was strange, and I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was obvious that the trucker wasn't comfortable either. The store clerk, who had been standing nearby, retreated inside, as if he wanted to distance himself from the man. The interaction lasted only a few minutes before the stranger finally gave up and, without warning, entered the convenience store. The trucker, in turn, looked around as if relieved that the man had walked away. That man didn't seem normal, and his presence was starting to make everyone at the station uneasy. After observing the interaction, I went back to the bus, feeling slightly unsettled. It was late, and all I wanted was for the driver to start the engine so we could continue the trip. Most of the passengers were still in their seats, many dozing off or distracted by their phones. I sat back down and waited, thinking about how the man in the torn jacket had caused that strange tension at the station. A few minutes later, the driver returned, clearly irritated by the argument he had outside. He slammed the doors shut and prepared to start the engine. I was relaxing when I noticed him freeze, staring intently into the rearview mirror. The expression on his face was one of total surprise. Curious, I turned to see what was happening, and then I saw him. At the back of the bus, the man in the torn jacket was sitting in one of the last seats, head down, as if he was completely at ease. No one had seen him get on, and the mood inside the bus changed instantly. The people around began whispering, looking at each other, confused about what was happening. The driver got up from his seat and walked to the back, trying to figure out how the man had gotten in without anyone noticing. He approached cautiously and asked what the stranger was doing there, but the man remained still, his hands in his lap, without saying a word. The tension in the bus grew with each passing second. The driver, now impatient, tried again to speak to the man. He asked if he had a ticket, if he was on the right bus, and told him he needed to leave. The man kept his head down, as if he couldn't hear a word. The other passengers began murmuring, worried about the situation, while some stood up from their seats to get a closer look. I watched everything from afar, unable to look away. The man didn't move, and the feeling that something was very wrong filled the air. The driver finally lost his patience and, in a sudden motion, tried to grab him by the arm. That's when things got really strange. Without lifting his head, the man gripped the driver's wrist with immense strength. The sound of bones cracking echoed through the bus, and the driver let out a scream of pain, immediately recoiling. Silence fell over the bus instantly. No one dared to move. The man in the jacket then slowly lifted his head, and in a low voice, muttered something no one could understand. His face remained expressionless, his eyes fixed on the driver, who was now visibly shaken, clutching his injured arm. The silence in the bus was only broken by the sound of the driver's heavy breathing. He stood in the aisle, massaging his wrist, but it was clear he was scared. All eyes were on the man in the jacket. Without warning, the driver tried to step back, but the stranger stood up abruptly, causing the other passengers to shrink into their seats. The man, who had seemed calm before, was now standing, his body rigid as if ready to act. The driver tried to hold his ground and ordered him to get off immediately, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, his head slightly tilted, staring at the driver with a vacant look, as if deciding what to do next. Then, in a swift motion, he stepped forward and pushed the driver, who stumbled and nearly fell. Now desperate, the driver yelled at him to get off the bus, but the man just watched in silence. Some passengers began shouting for help, while others, including me, remained frozen, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the man in the jacket turned toward the door and, without a word, calmly walked off the bus, disappearing into the darkness of the night. After the man disappeared into the darkness, the silence inside the bus was suffocating. No one moved, as if everyone was trying to process what had just happened. The driver, still recovering from the push, breathed heavily, his eyes fixed on the open door, as if expecting the stranger to come back at any moment. Some passengers started whispering to each other, trying to understand who that man was and how he had gotten on the bus unnoticed. Others just stared at the floor, still in shock. The driver slowly returned to his seat, visibly shaken, and started the engine. For a moment he hesitated, glancing at the rearview mirror, as if wanting to make sure the man had really gone. When the doors finally closed, the bus started moving. The sound of the engine was the only thing that broke the silence, but no one spoke anymore. The trip continued, but the atmosphere inside the bus never returned to normal. I kept looking out the window, trying to spot any trace of the man on the deserted road, but there was only darkness outside. That strange silence that had settled in the bus seemed to accompany the journey, and even when we finally reached our destination, the feeling of unease remained. The man had left, but the impression that something sinister had happened would stay with me for a long time. It was the beginning of summer, and the city was buzzing with life. The streets were full of people, laughter, and the smell of food from the stalls that popped up on every corner. The sun was shining intensely, making everyone eager to enjoy every moment outdoors. I decided to join in on the energy and explore the urban area, diving into a world I didn't yet know. As I walked, I noticed the shops, cafes, and small restaurants, admiring the old architecture mixed with the new buildings that blended into the skyline. Amidst this exploration, something caught my attention. An old, seemingly abandoned building stood out among the others. Its facade was worn, with broken windows and an air of mystery that piqued my curiosity. With a sense of adventure, I decided to enter. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a dark, dusty lobby with a strong smell of mold filling the air. The daylight barely penetrated the dirty curtains, and the place seemed forgotten by time. The walls, covered in graffiti, told stories of a dark past. The wooden floor creaked under my feet, and the feeling that I was about to enter a place few dared to explore grew stronger. As I crossed the threshold, a wave of cold, stale air wrapped around me, sending a slight shiver down my spine. The sound of the creaking door echoed through the empty lobby, as if waking the place from a long sleep. I looked around, feeling the solitude of the abandoned space. The light was scarce, and shadows danced on the walls, creating shapes that seemed to move. The lobby was filled with objects covered in dust. An old, torn, and faded couch leaned against a wall, while tables and chairs were scattered about, some overturned. The smell of mold was intense, mixed with a faint scent of rotting wood, as if time had left its mark on every corner. With cautious steps, I began to explore. My gaze lingered on the graffiti adorning the walls, some with cryptic messages that seemed to tell stories of sadness and rebellion. A sense of unease began to set in, but curiosity pushed me forward. The place felt like a maze, and I was an intruder in a world that no longer belonged to anyone. I walked toward a staircase in the corner of the lobby, deciding that going up might reveal more secrets of the place. Each step creaked under my weight, and the light from the upper window faintly illuminated the path. But what awaited me upstairs remained a mystery. The sound of the wind outside mingled with the creaking of the stairs, and for a moment I thought I heard a whisper. I hesitated, but curiosity outweighed fear, and I continued my journey. On the second floor, the atmosphere was even heavier. The narrow hallway was wrapped in shadows, and the doors to the rooms were closed, as if guarding long-forgotten secrets. The light filtering through the dusty windows cast intriguing patterns on the wooden floor, which creaked with every step I took. The smell of mold was overpowering, almost as if the building itself was breathing, and I felt small and insignificant within those walls full of stories. I decided to explore the rooms, pushing open the first door I found. It creaked open, revealing an empty space, except for some broken furniture and a pile of yellowed papers in the corner. I flipped through a few of them, but the words were jumbled and the ink had faded, making it difficult to understand their meaning. A slight chill ran down my spine, and I quickly left the room, eager to find something more interesting. The next room was also empty, but in one corner, I found an old wooden box covered in dust. Curious, I approached and opened it. Inside were objects of various shapes and sizes, a broken watch, a rusty key, and a small porcelain doll with a sad, vacant expression. I held the doll, and as I looked at its face, a strange sensation came over me, as if the doll itself was watching me. I decided it was time to move on, so I left the room and headed to the end of the hallway. An ajar door caught my attention, and I couldn't resist. I approached slowly and carefully pushed the door open. Upon entering, I was greeted by a different scene. A large space filled with stacked boxes and furniture covered with white sheets. The dim light illuminated the room in a ghostly way, and for a moment I thought I might be walking into a cemetery of forgotten objects. As I walked among the boxes, I noticed something was out of place. The silence was oppressive, but suddenly I heard a sound. It was a low murmur, barely audible, coming from somewhere deep within the space. My heart started to race, and the curiosity that had led me there now mixed with a hint of fear. I knew something wasn't right, but the urge to discover what was happening pushed me forward, toward the sound. The staircase leading to the second floor was narrow and dimly lit, with dark wooden steps that creaked with every step. As I approached, a sense of apprehension settled in my chest. The structure seemed old, as if it might collapse at any moment, but curiosity drove me to continue. The silence around me was almost deafening, and the only sound I could hear was the creaking of the wood beneath my feet. Cautiously, I placed a foot on the first step. The sound echoed, reverberating through the empty lobby. The faint light filtering through the dusty window illuminated the staircase, but the shadows danced around me, creating a feeling that something or someone might be watching me. With each step, the stairs seemed to protest, as if warning me about what might be waiting upstairs. Reaching the top, I found a small hallway stretching out in front of me, with doors on either side. The smell of mold and old wood was stronger here, almost nauseating. The walls were covered in graffiti and damp stains, as if the place had been slowly decaying over the years. I looked around nervously, but also excited about the possibility of uncovering something hidden. I decided to explore the rooms, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The sound of the stairs kept echoing in my mind, and every time I moved, it felt like the place was alive, waiting for my next action. I hesitated, wondering if I should turn back, but curiosity prevented me from giving up. Part of me wanted to uncover what was there, even knowing I was in a place where few dared to venture. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease, and pressed on, eager to discover what else the upper floor had to offer. But as I ventured further, the certainty that something was wrong began to solidify, like a premonition I couldn't ignore. As I walked down the hallway on the second floor, I noticed the oppressive silence was broken by low murmurs. The voices were indistinct but sounded tense and nervous. Curious and apprehensive, I stopped in front of a door that was slightly ajar, allowing me to peek inside. The light from the hallway wasn't enough to fully illuminate the space, but I could make out figures moving in the unsettling gloom. A group of people was gathered around a table, their silhouettes twisting in the shadows. Their expressions weren't visible, but their body language suggested agitation and discomfort. The sense that something serious was happening made me hesitate. I stood there, trying to hear more of what was being discussed, but the voices were muffled and incoherent. Only fragments reached me, disconnected words that didn't make sense. "We have to fix this. She can't know. And where's the plan?" The air was thick with tension, and I could feel it, as if everyone there was waiting for something. With every breath, curiosity mingled with a growing sense of unease. I decided I needed to go in, but at the same time, an inner voice warned me about the dangers of revealing myself to these people. Before I could decide, one of the men stood up abruptly, gesturing wildly, as if emphasizing an important point. The movement made me step back a little, not wanting to be seen. When the man turned, his shadows danced on the walls, creating distorted figures that seemed almost threatening. The group fell silent, and the atmosphere grew even heavier. They all seemed to turn toward the door where I stood, and I quickly realized that curiosity had shifted into an instinct for survival. The voices and shadows became a tangled mess of conflicting emotions inside me. The realization that I was in a dangerous place became undeniable, and instinctively, my body braced for flight. But something in that dark, secret-filled room kept calling to me, like the distant echo of an unsolved mystery. Slowly, I pushed the door open, letting it reveal what was happening in that shadowy space. As soon as I stepped in, the voices that had been a whisper turned into a cry of alarm. The group turned toward me, their expressions shifting from confused to hostile. One man stood out, his eyes burning with anger and surprise. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice thundering through the room. I froze, adrenaline flooding my body as I tried to think of a response. Fear settled over me, and I realized I was in a situation I didn't fully understand. I was just exploring the building. I managed to mumble, but the words sounded weak against the palpable tension. The woman who had spoken earlier, her eyes shining with fear, moved aside as if she wanted to shield me, but the situation didn't seem to allow for that. The man in the torn jacket stepped closer, his face showing disdain. "You shouldn't be here," he said, almost as a threat. The other members of the group began whispering among themselves, and the atmosphere in the room shifted quickly, as if a storm was about to break. A wave of desperation surged through me. What were they doing here? What were they hiding? Before I could process everything, the man advanced toward me, his dominating presence forcing me to retreat. The instinctive urge to flee took hold of me. Without thinking, I turned and ran toward the exit, but the door was slightly ajar, and my movement was enough to cause the others to rise. "Wait!" one of them shouted, and panic turned into a sense of urgency. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind me as I descended the stairs, the wood creaking under the pressure of my hurried escape. But it wasn't just a physical escape. With each step, it felt like I was fleeing from something far more sinister than a nervous group. Shouts and fragmented words followed behind me, echoing through the hallway. "She can't leave. We need to do something." These phrases only fueled my desperation, but the only thing I wanted was to escape that prison of shadows. When I finally reached the lobby, my eyes fixed on the exit. The cold night awaited me, and the moonlight seemed like a promise of safety. I turned the knob, and as I opened the door, a gust of fresh air hit me, but the scream still echoed in my mind, reminding me that the darkness could be right behind me. As I made it outside, a brief sense of relief washed over me, but the fear remained, pulsing in my chest. I glanced quickly behind me, but I saw no one following. It was a cold winter night, and I was in an old cabin deep in the woods with a group of friends. We had decided to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and spend the weekend in a secluded place, without distractions, to relax and enjoy the tranquility. The cabin had a rustic charm: aged wooden walls, small windows that barely let the light in, and a fireplace in the corner, whose flickering flame illuminated the room and provided a cozy warmth. Outside, the snow was falling gently, covering the ground like a white blanket, and the wind howled through the trees, creating a distant, almost hypnotic melody. We were all gathered around the fireplace, talking and telling stories while the crackling of the wood broke the silence of the night. We laughed loudly, sharing memories and anecdotes. Everything seemed calm and serene. It was hard to imagine that anything could disturb that peace. But between sips of our drinks, someone mentioned the mysteries of the surrounding forest, and the mood shifted. After a few hours of conversation, curiosity took over the group. One of my friends suggested we should go out and explore the woods around the cabin. The idea seemed fun at first, something to break the monotony of the night. We grabbed flashlights, put on our heaviest coats, and headed out the door, leaving the comfortable warmth of the fireplace behind. The cold air hit hard as soon as we stepped into the snow. The forest during the day seemed serene, but at night, under the dim light of the flashlights, it had a different atmosphere. The rustling of the leaves, the sound of snow crunching under our feet, and the wind blowing through the branches created a scene that, though beautiful, was unsettling. The darkness was dense, and the trees stood like giant shadows around us. The light from the flashlights only illuminated small patches in front of us, leaving the rest shrouded in almost impenetrable darkness. As we walked, we laughed and joked, trying to shake off the tension that was starting to build. However, the further we went, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The sound of our footsteps seemed to echo, and a sense of unease began to spread among us. We had been walking through the forest for a while, and the mood had grown quieter. At first, we had casual conversations, but gradually the discomfort settled in. The darkness seemed thicker, and the light from the flashlights barely pierced through it. Each of us began to look around more, as if we were expecting something unexpected to happen at any moment. That's when one of my friends suddenly stopped. He stared intently into the trees and, with a whisper, asked us to do the same. We fell silent, trying to see what had alarmed him. At first, I noticed nothing, just shadows dancing as the wind moved the branches. But then, suddenly, something stood out. Between the trees, a little farther ahead, there was a figure standing still. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of that. The shape was human, but it seemed off somehow. The person was motionless, facing us, wearing what appeared to be a hood that completely hid their face. We froze, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. No one said a word. The figure didn't move. It didn't walk toward us, but it didn't seem to be just passing by either. It was as if it was watching us. My heart raced, and I could see that my friends were also tense. A heavy silence settled over the group, and for a few moments, no one knew what to do. We headed back to the cabin quickly, practically running. No one dared to look back. The figure we had seen in the woods seemed to follow us mentally, as if its presence was still near. When we finally reached the cabin, we slammed the door shut and locked everything we could. The air inside felt less welcoming than before, even with the warmth of the fireplace. The atmosphere that had once been relaxed was now filled with tension. We sat around the fire, but there were no more laughs or stories. The silence was almost palpable, and each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had seen. Every now and then, someone would glance at the window, as if expecting to see something out there, but all we could see was darkness and the shadows of the trees. The sound of the wind and the snow falling outside created an even greater sense of isolation. The atmosphere had completely changed. Every crackle of the wood in the fireplace made us jump, and the once cozy cabin had become uncomfortable. The tension was undeniable. Something outside, or maybe just in our minds, was deeply unsettling, and none of us knew how to break that oppressive mood. We were sitting in silence, trying to calm our nerves when the sound came. 3 sharp knocks on the door. Everyone exchanged glances, frozen. No one wanted to be the first to say something, but the tension in the air was palpable. I hoped it was my imagination, maybe the wind or some animal, but the knocks came again, now a little stronger and more insistent. The fire crackled softly, casting light on our frightened faces. I looked at the door, trying to see if there was any shadow behind it, but everything seemed calm outside. One of my friends stood up, visibly nervous, and slowly walked to the window. He peeked through a crack in the curtains but shook his head, saying he couldn't see anyone. The knocking continued, steady and firm, as if someone or something wanted to come inside. No one moved, as if the fear of opening the door was greater than the curiosity to know who was there. The feeling that something very wrong was happening overtook us. The thought that, just moments before, we had seen that figure in the forest made the air inside the cabin feel suffocating. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was even more disturbing. The tension was already unbearable when the sound came, abrupt and terrifying. Something slammed violently against the door, making it shake on its hinges. The noise echoed through the cabin walls, as if the place itself was about to collapse. Everyone stood up at once, panicked, unsure of what to do. The impact was so strong it seemed the wood wouldn't withstand another blow. We rushed to push furniture against the door, in a desperate attempt to block the entrance. The table, the chairs, even the old cabinet in the living room were used as an improvised barricade. While we tried to hold the door, another crash came, as if something heavy was trying to break through everything we had piled up. The noise was deafening, seeming to come from all sides. The cabin walls trembled, and I felt that whatever it was getting closer to breaking through the door. We were surrounded by sounds that made no sense. Quick footsteps outside, scratching at the windows, and something like a low, constant buzzing that seemed to fill the air around us. With no cell signal and completely isolated, we felt trapped, like rats in a cage. We huddled in a corner of the room, trying to come up with any solution to survive the night. Fear kept us alert, but also paralyzed. Every sound, every knock brought with it the sensation that the worst was yet to come. Time seemed to drag on, and all we could do was wait. After hours of agony, the first signs of light began to filter through the window. The night had been endless, with the noises outside haunting us every second. But suddenly, silence settled in. There were no more knocks, no footsteps, no sounds, just the distant wind cutting through the trees. It was as if the entire forest had entered a mysterious calm at dawn. We were exhausted, but we knew we couldn't stay there forever. When the sunlight finally lit up the cabin, we gathered the courage to stand up. The barricade was still in place, untouched. We looked at each other, trying to muster our strength, and decided to open the door. Stepping outside, the winter chill enveloped us, and the first thing we saw were the footprints. They were in the fresh snow, leading towards the forest. They were large, larger than any humans. They circled the entire cabin, as if something had been watching us all night, studying our every move. Even stranger was noticing that around the door the snow was disturbed, as if something heavy had indeed collided with it several times. But there were no signs of any tools or objects that could explain what caused the crashes. We followed the footprints with our eyes until they disappeared into the dense forest. There was no way to know who or what had been there, and perhaps it was better that way. The morning silence was almost oppressive, contrasting with the terror we had felt just hours before. Without wasting any more time, we quickly gathered our things and left. We didn't say a word on the way back. Each of us was trying to process what had happened, but the only certainty we had was that we would never return to that cabin. The footprints, the silence that followed, and the mystery of that night would stay with us, but the answers were lost in that forest, like a secret that would never be uncovered. It was a winter night, and the city felt different. Darkness enveloped every corner, and the streetlights flickered timidly, casting long, unsettling shadows on the sidewalks. I was heading home after a tiring day, and the weight of exhaustion mixed with a strange feeling I couldn't quite identify. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the empty streets, a constant reminder that I was alone in a place that would normally be familiar. As I walked, the shadows seemed to shift around me, and a cold breeze blew, sending a chill down my spine. The path I was on was the same as always, but the atmosphere was heavy with something unknown. Even with the deserted streets, there was an uneasiness that followed me, like someone was watching. I tried to focus on the distance to my house, but the discomfort only grew with each step. The few cars that passed were like ghosts in the dark, and I wondered if anyone else felt what I was feeling. Every movement around me, no matter how small, caught my attention, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, looking for any sign that I wasn't alone that night. When I turned the corner, I saw a figure in the distance standing on the sidewalk. The man was motionless, his hands in his pockets, and his hood covering most of his face. The distance between us was significant, but even so, a shiver ran through my body. What was he doing there, at this time of night, on such an empty street? I tried to ignore his presence and kept walking, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The figure didn't move, but I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see him clearly. Every step I took seemed to echo louder, and the atmosphere around me felt heavy, as if the city was holding its breath. Curiosity and fear waged a battle inside me. The urge to look back was almost irresistible, but at the same time, I knew that could give him more reason to approach. I kept my eyes forward, but part of me couldn't ignore the man, who remained there, standing and watching. Then, as I passed by him, a sense of relief started to form. However, the freedom was brief. As soon as I passed, I realized he began to follow me, keeping a considerable distance. My heart raced. The man made noise, but the feeling that he was following me was palpable, like a weight pressing on my shoulders. I hoped it was just a coincidence, but the further I walked, the more the discomfort settled in. The city was deserted, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I was in a trap. With each step I took, the figure kept his distance, but the fear inside me grew. I didn't want to appear hurried, but the need to escape the situation became urgent. I decided to pick up the pace, trying to stay calm. The sound of my footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, and the silence of the night was disturbing. When I glanced back quickly, I confirmed what I feared. The man was following me. His hood still covered his face, but his steps were closer now, as if he was testing me. Adrenaline took over, and without thinking, I started to run. The impulse was instinctive, a primal need to escape the looming danger. Crossing the street, I passed by some doors, trying to find refuge, but they were all locked, as if the city had decided to abandon me. The houses around me were dark, with curtains drawn, and I wondered if anyone inside knew what was happening. The only certainty was that the man was getting closer, and the thought of being alone on a deserted street at night, followed by a stranger, was terrifying. I darted into a narrow alley, thinking I could lose him. The space was tight, surrounded by trash cans and shadows that seemed to move as I ran. The sound of his heavy breathing echoed behind me, getting louder. Darkness enveloped me, and all I could hear was the frantic beating of my heart. The feeling of being watched became more unbearable with every second. Desperation set in when I realized I couldn't keep running forever. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare, trying to wake up but unable to. The only visible escape was the faint light shining at the end of the alley, and the hope of finding safety there pushed me to run faster. With the man still on my tail, I needed a plan. The shadows danced around me, and the pressure in my chest grew with each step. The sensation that he was closer than ever made me desperately search for a way to lose him. As soon as I entered the alley, I looked for any place to hide. The walls were covered in graffiti, and a strong smell of garbage hung in the air. There were a few cardboard boxes piled in a corner, and for a moment I considered hiding behind them. The problem was, if he saw me enter, there would be no way to escape. I decided not to take the risk. I kept running, trying to stay calm and think of a strategy. I looked around and saw a narrower alley to the left. If I could get in there, maybe I could turn the situation around. Adrenaline was pulsing through my veins, and every decision seemed crucial. I quickly turned left, hoping the swift movement would be enough to shake him off. The alley was tight and dark, but the only sound I could hear was my own heart pounding. I kept running, now at a more controlled pace, trying to use the darkness to my advantage. The walls were so close that, at times, it felt like I could touch them with outstretched arms. I continued forward, trying to listen for any sign of him behind me, but the silence was deafening. After a few meters, I noticed a small entrance to the right. What looked like an abandoned warehouse was slightly open, and an impulse drove me to enter. The door creaked softly as I pushed it, and I squeezed inside, closing it slowly behind me. The darkness was almost complete, but the streetlight filtered through a broken window, revealing the shadows of boxes and furniture covered in dust. I stood still, listening carefully. The sound of my own footsteps still echoed in my mind, but I no longer heard the man's. I had managed to lose him. However, the relief was short-lived, as I knew I was still far from safe. I tried to calm myself and control my breathing, hoping he hadn't seen me enter. As I waited, I realized I was merely delaying the inevitable. The feeling that he could appear at any moment was oppressive. The narrow alley felt like a maze of shadows, and every step I took echoed in the darkness, a reminder of the danger that followed me. The air was heavy and cold, with the smell of mold and garbage mixed with a sense of despair settling deep in my stomach. The walls were so close that I could feel their dampness as I moved carefully. Trash cans were piled in one corner, and some cardboard boxes were scattered across the ground, making the path difficult. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my labored breathing and the distant echoes of the city in the background. It was a surreal sensation, as if the outside world had vanished, and I was trapped in a bubble of tension. As I moved along the alley, I noticed the shadows seemed to shift. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw the outline of tangled objects. Some pieces of broken furniture, perhaps remnants of a more prosperous time, now mere memories of a forgotten past. Every time I heard a noise, my body tensed, and I looked back, hoping not to see that figure following me. For a moment, I thought I had found a safe place, but I soon realized the feeling of claustrophobia was overwhelming. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the silence was stifling. A faint whisper of wind made me think about how I could quickly escape from there. The idea of being trapped in that place, isolated and vulnerable, left me uneasy. Finally, I knew I couldn't stay there for long. The darkness and solitude were almost tangible. With renewed determination, I decided I needed to keep moving. I looked around, searching for an exit. The alley seemed endless, but there was a faint light at the end that could indicate a path to freedom. I took a deep breath and began walking toward the light, each step an act of courage amid the growing fear. As I exited the alley, the light from a bar appeared like a beacon of hope in the night's darkness. My heart was still racing, but that yellowish glow gave me a bit of courage. With one last look behind me, I quickened my pace and pushed the door open with force, as if escaping from a nightmare. The atmosphere inside the bar was a stark contrast to the tension I had left behind. With soft music playing in the background and the smell of alcohol, a few people were lost in quiet conversations. The bartender, a middle-aged man, gave me a curious look. "Are you okay?" he asked, concerned. Before I could respond, I heard the door open again. Panic set in as I saw the figure that had been chasing me at the entrance, his face still hidden under the hood. He paused for a moment, assessing the room, and the music seemed to quiet. I felt paralyzed, adrenaline coursing through my body. But then, surprisingly, he turned and left, as if deciding the bar wasn't what he was looking for. The door slowly closed behind him, and life in the bar resumed, as if nothing had happened. The bartender approached, concerned. "Do you need something? You look like you've had a scare." "A glass of water, please," I replied, trying to catch my breath. As I drank, my hands trembled. The sense of safety the bar offered was comforting, but the image of the mysterious man was still fresh in my mind. The conversation around the tables continued, but I could barely focus. The reality that I was still being pursued lingered over me, even in a place that should have been safe. As I sat at the bar, trying to process what had happened, A wave of relief mixed with confusion began to settle in. The conversations around me, once reassuring, now felt distant, as if I were in a world apart. The bartender brought my water and gave me a look of concern. "If you need help, just let me know," he said, and that made me realize I wasn't as alone as I thought. However, the memory of the figure that had been following me still lingered, like a shadow in my mind. What did he want? Why had he followed me? The questions swirled like a whirlwind with no answers. It was a cold, rainy night, typical of winter. The dark sky seemed to weigh down on the city, and the streets were almost deserted, except for the constant sound of rain hitting the sidewalks. I was heading home after a long day at college, my back sore and my mind full of information. The path I usually took always felt safe and familiar, but that night there was something different in the air, a sense of unease I couldn't shake off. The streetlights flickered, casting dancing shadows that mingled with the darkness. With each step, the sound of the rain seemed to echo louder, as if it were watching me, intensifying the feeling that something wasn't right. The gloomy, silent atmosphere, combined with the heavy rain, created an almost oppressive ambiance. Instinctively, I decided that it would be best to cut through the train station, which was only a few blocks away. What should have been a simple walk home began to feel like a journey through a horror movie set, where every shadow and every sound could hide a terrifying mystery. As I approached the train station, the idea of taking a shortcut seemed more and more appealing. The wind howled between the buildings, and the rain fell frantically, making the walk down the main street even more uncomfortable. The station, though usually bustling, was deserted that night, which left me feeling a bit apprehensive. I entered the station and felt a chill as I noticed the lights flickering intermittently, casting shadows that moved strangely along the concrete walls. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of raindrops trickling off the roofs and hitting the ground, creating small puddles. I looked at the clock and realized the last train had already left, leaving the platform empty and solemn. The feeling that I was the only person around heightened the tension in the air. Choosing to cut through the station, which seemed so rational on a normal day, now felt like an unwise decision. Still, the thought of returning to the rain outside was even less appealing. I took a deep breath and decided to keep going, walking along the platform, trying to ignore the growing discomfort building in my chest. What should have been a quiet crossing had turned into a scene heavy with anticipation, as if something were about to happen. As I walked slowly along the empty platform, the dim, flickering lights cast shadows that danced around me. The silence was oppressive, almost as if the station were holding its breath. Then, I heard a noise in the distance, a faint crackle that made me stop. I turned to look, and that's when I saw him. Leaning against the wall was a man with a hood covering most of his face. He was smoking a cigarette, the smoke blending with the humid night air, forming ephemeral clouds that mingled with the mist of the rain. His eyes, though hidden, seemed to be fixed on me, piercing and evaluative. A shiver ran down my spine, and the feeling of unease grew, as if I were being sized up by a predator. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't resist the urge to glance again. He didn't move, just continued watching me with that enigmatic smile, which sent a chill through my stomach. The image of the hooded man, still and silent, seemed to etch itself into my mind. I tried to quicken my pace, but the feeling that he was moving toward me increased with every second. The environment around me seemed to close in, as if the darkness were thickening. Each step I took toward the exit became heavier. His presence was undeniable, and I didn't know if I should run or keep walking. The urge to escape grew, but the thought of provoking an unwanted reaction kept me from acting impulsively. The man seemed to represent something dark, something I couldn't comprehend on that cold, rainy night. The tension in the air became palpable when I realized the hooded man had started to move. As I passed him, I felt an intense shiver, as if I were being pulled back by an invisible force. The echo of my footsteps mingled with the sound of the rain, and I tried to ignore the feeling that he was now following me. I quickly glanced back and confirmed my suspicion. He was a few steps behind, keeping a steady pace. My heart raced, and a sinking feeling overtook me. The train station, once familiar, had now turned into an oppressive maze, and the flickering lights did nothing to dispel the growing darkness. I sped up, trying to stay calm. Each step I took was followed by the sound of his steps, mirroring my movement with precision. The man said nothing, but his intense, unwavering gaze left me on edge. The feeling that I was being hunted intensified, and adrenaline began to course through my veins. I searched for an exit, but the options were limited. The only door leading to the street was just a few meters away, and I needed to reach it before he got any closer. I looked around, trying to find something I could use to protect myself or distract him, but everything around me seemed useless. The only thing I could do was run. I quickened my pace even more, the rain falling heavily around me. The sound of my footsteps and his mixed together, creating a terrifying rhythm. The station, which should have been a safe place, was now the scene of a chase. The urgency to escape pushed me forward, but at the same time, the darkness seemed to close in on me, as if I was being swallowed by a nightmare. When I finally reached the exit, a wave of hope flooded my body. The door was in sight, and the dark sky outside promised the freedom I desperately craved. But when I tried to open the door, I realized it was stuck. I forced the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to build inside me, and the sound of the man's footsteps approaching behind me grew louder. I glanced back and saw that he was only a few meters away now, with a strange smile on his face, as if he was enjoying my distress. His fixed, penetrating gaze made me feel like I was being hunted, and the helplessness of being trapped inside that station made my heart race even more. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. I tried pushing the door with all the strength I had, but it wouldn't give. The man started moving slowly towards me, as if he wanted to savor the moment. Fear paralyzed me for an instant, but I quickly realized I couldn't stay there. I took a deep breath and shoved the door with all the force in my body. Finally, the handle gave way, and the door creaked open. Without thinking twice, I ran into the street. The rain was pouring down, but I didn't care. The terror I felt outweighed any discomfort. I needed to get away from that man. The sound of my feet hitting the pavement mixed with the noise of the rain, and I glanced back one last time, hoping he wasn't following me. But the feeling that I was still being watched persisted, and the adrenaline pushed me to run faster into the unknown. I ducked into a narrow alley, desperate for a safe place to hide. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the light was scarce, almost non-existent. The sound of the rain echoed around me, blending with the noise of my hurried footsteps. The alley seemed endless, and the pressure of fear made my heart race. The shadows stretched around me, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I looked back, but saw no sign of the hooded man. Even so, the certainty that he could appear at any moment made me uneasy. I decided to move further away from the exit, searching for refuge. Finally, I spotted a slightly open door to my left. With a surge of courage, I entered the old shop, filled with dusty boxes and furniture covered in sheets. The smell of mold was strong, but I didn't have time to think about it. The only thought occupying my mind was finding a place to hide. I hid behind a shelf, holding my breath and trying to calm my mind. The sound of the rain continued, but now there was another sound, the echo of his footsteps approaching, breaking the silence of the shop. The tension was palpable, and I could feel every beat of my heart as if it were an alarm. I remained still, hoping he wouldn't find me there. The man's footsteps grew closer, and the atmosphere in the old shop became more oppressive with every second. His steps echoed off the walls, and I wondered if he already knew I was hiding there. The faint light coming through the slightly open door barely illuminated the space, and I could hardly see his outline. Finally, he entered the shop. Looking around, he seemed calm, but there was something unsettling in his gaze. The strange smile he had worn before had now turned into a neutral expression, but that didn't lessen the tension in the air. My heart pounded, and I held my breath, fearing that any movement would alert him to my presence. He wandered a bit, examining the shelves and dusty objects as if he were searching for something. Each second felt like an eternity. Just when I thought he might leave, a trash can toppled over, making a deafening noise. He immediately turned in my direction, and adrenaline surged through my body. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. With a burst of energy, I decided to run. I darted out from behind the shelf and lunged for the door. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest, and the sound of my footsteps mixed with the rain outside. The man quickly turned, and I saw him moving toward me, but the door was open, and I threw myself outside. The cold rain hit me full force, but I didn't care. I ran without looking back, racing down the slick street, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The sound of the rain and my footsteps echoed through the empty streets, and the adrenaline drove me to run faster. Without stopping to think, I turned a corner and kept running, crossing the familiar path that led home. Finally, I reached the safety of my apartment. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping for breath. It was a morning like any other, but it carried a special sense of anticipation. I was on my way to my first day at a new office, and the mix of anxiety and excitement made me more alert than usual. The sky was slightly overcast, and the pleasant weather seemed perfect for the start of a new chapter. The streets were full of hurried people, each heading to their own commitments, while I walked towards the building that would soon become part of my routine. When I arrived, I was immediately struck by the building's grandeur. The glass structure reflected the little sunlight that peeked through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the surroundings. I walked through the revolving doors, and as I crossed the bustling lobby, I felt that familiar nervous flutter in my stomach that comes with the start of something new. The elevator awaited, and as it ascended to the designated floor, I watched the numbers flash on the display, as if marking the beginning of a journey. Everything seemed promising, and I was determined to give my best on this first day. When I stepped out of the elevator and onto the office floor, the first thing that caught my attention was the silence. The environment was modern, with white walls and glass nearly everywhere. The desks were neatly arranged, and the dark wooden floors gave the place an elegant touch. Yet, despite the sophisticated design, there was a certain coldness in the air, as if the space wasn't very welcoming. As I walked to my desk, I noticed that the few people around seemed focused on their screens, almost oblivious to my presence. I received a brief nod from one or two colleagues, but nothing too warm. I passed through the corridor, observing the details. Shelves with neatly organized files, minimalist paintings on the walls, and soft lighting that contrasted with the natural light coming from the huge windows. My desk was near one of the meeting rooms. As soon as I sat down, I could hear some muffled voices through the door. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but the way they whispered intrigued me. There was something different about the atmosphere. The first impression was that everything was running smoothly and efficiently, but there was something in the air that left me with a slight sense of discomfort, as if I were being watched from afar. As the day went on, I started paying more attention to my coworker, the one I was supposed to collaborate with on the project. He worked in the room next to mine, but what caught my attention wasn't his proximity, but rather his peculiar behavior. He spent long periods in silence, his gaze fixed on the computer screen or some paper, as if he was absorbed in something far more serious than regular work. Every now and then, he would lift his head and look at me, but he always quickly diverted his gaze, as if trying to avoid any interaction. Additionally, he often left the room, almost always in a hurry, muttering something to himself or fidgeting with a paper, a frustrated expression on his face. When he returned, he seemed more tense, with slightly red eyes, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. Sometimes I saw him walking through the corridors, looking around, as if he was searching for someone or something. During breaks, the office atmosphere became more relaxed, but he never joined anyone. He stayed alone in his room, the door slightly ajar, but he never seemed truly engaged in what he was doing. The strangest part was that, even in silence, I could feel that he was always watching me, as if studying my every move. With each quick glance we exchanged, the sense of unease grew. At lunchtime, I decided it was time to break the ice and get to know this coworker better. The strange atmosphere in the office and the tension I felt with every interaction were starting to bother me too much to ignore. I walked over to his room, and when I got to the door, I knocked lightly before entering. He was sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers, his head down, almost as if he hadn't noticed my presence. When I raised my voice to greet him, he slowly lifted his eyes. He forced a smile, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel even more uncomfortable. It was as if he was trying to hide something. "Hey, I was thinking of inviting you to lunch. How about it?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He hesitated for a moment, looking at his watch and then at me before replying, "Sure, why not?" His voice was low, almost monotone, but he stood up and followed me to the door. The walk to the cafeteria was silent, and the air of discomfort only seemed to grow. Sitting at the restaurant, I tried to make conversation about work and the project we were involved in, but he responded vaguely, as if his mind was elsewhere. Every now and then he looked around, as if expecting someone to appear or something unusual to happen. The questions I asked were answered evasively, and no matter how hard I tried to engage him in a conversation, he always shifted the focus elsewhere. There was a palpable tension in the air, but it wasn't just the anxiety of a first day at work. It felt like he was worried about something I couldn't quite understand. As lunch ended, the feeling that something was deeply wrong only intensified. After returning from lunch, I tried to focus on my work, but my coworker's strange behavior lingered in my mind. There was something unsettling about the way he acted, as if he were always suspicious or nervous. It was almost the end of the afternoon, and I found myself alone in the room when my phone vibrated. I picked it up, assuming it was just a random notification, but what I saw made me freeze. It was a message from an unknown number, with a direct and disturbing content. "You need to be careful with him. He's not who he seems to be." For a moment, I stood still, unsure of what to think. I looked around, trying to determine if this was some kind of bad joke, but the silence in the office only intensified the seriousness of the situation. My mind began racing for explanations. Who could have sent that message? Why should I be careful with someone I barely knew? I glanced toward my coworker's office, but he wasn't there. The place seemed empty. The message echoed in my head, and a sense of impending danger began to grow. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The tension within me was building. With the message still on my phone screen, I got up and walked toward my coworker's office. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. When I entered, I realized he wasn't there. The room felt empty and silent, but the atmosphere was strange, almost oppressive. I looked around, and something caught my attention, an open notebook on his desk. I cautiously approached, and when I looked at the notes, I felt a chill run down my spine. They were lists of names and dates, scribbled hastily, with some names crossed out. None of it made sense to me, but the chaotic organization and the sheer number of names alarmed me. In the middle of the pages, there were several notes that looked like codes or abbreviations, and one name that I recognized, mine. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickly turned and saw my coworker standing in the doorway, staring at me coldly. His expression was no longer the same as before. That forced smile and nervous demeanor were gone. Now he seemed like a completely different person, with a threatening expression and a blank stare. "You shouldn't have looked at that," he said in a low but firm voice, taking a step toward me. Without thinking, I backed away from the desk, trying to keep a safe distance between us. He continued to stare at me intently, without breaking eye contact. The door was still open, but he was blocking my only exit. The silence in the room became suffocating, and I knew I needed to act fast. "You shouldn't have looked at that," he repeated, now with a more menacing tone. He took another step toward me, and my body reacted before I could even think. I shoved him with all the strength I could muster, and he stumbled to the side. I seized the opportunity and ran toward the door. My footsteps echoed down the hallway as I sprinted toward the elevator. When the doors finally opened, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor repeatedly, as if that would make the elevator descend faster. When I glanced back, I saw my coworker standing at the end of the corridor, staring at me, saying nothing. As soon as the elevator doors closed, I felt a brief sense of relief. But only when I reached the ground floor and exited the building did the feeling of danger begin to dissipate. I looked back at the office's facade, expecting him to be following me, but there was no sign of him.